We're very excited to be back. This semester, where the lecture series is focusing on the issue of Chinese migration. We're going to be looking at movement of Chinese people globally, as well as domestically, historically, as well as in the contemporary moment. And I'm super excited about this. It's linked to a new course that I'm teaching. I'm pleased to see a number of my students here. I want to thank the East Asia program for making this happening. Obviously, we had initially planned to do this in person. And like everything else, we're making do. But it's going to be a really great series, and pleased that East Asia program has been able to continue to support this. Before we turn it over to our speaker, just a few housekeeping items. The first is I just want to alert everyone to the next CCCI event. We're going to be inviting Chen Zhang here. She's giving a talk called Hukou and Suzhi as Technologies of Governing Citizenship and Migration. It's going to be March 8th at 2:30 p.m. There's going to be another event in March, on March 18th, called Inequality, Labor, and Migration in East Asia through the Prism of the Global Pandemic. So these should both be really excellent events, and I believe information to those has just been posted into the chat. While Professor Candela is giving her talk, we ask that everyone keep their audio muted and your video off in order to save on bandwidth. And we would invite you to turn both of those back on during Q&A while you're posing questions. You can either use the raise hand function. If you prefer to just post something in the chat, then I'll be monitoring that, and I can and then I can pose them to Professor Candela. So with that, I just want to say that we are extremely pleased to welcome Anna Candela as the first speaker in this lecture series. Professor Candela is an assistant professor of sociology at Binghamton University, which is just down the road in Binghamton. Today, actually, Anna is joining us from Paris, France. Like many of us, her plans have been thrown up in the air. And so that is partially why we're doing this talk somewhat earlier than usual, given the time difference. And we're glad that she's able to sort of join us from across the ocean. Her work, I won't say much about it, but she takes a global perspective on Chinese migration, and specifically is looking at Cantonese migration to Latin America in the 19th and early 20th century. And she's currently writing a book on this very topic. So I'll leave it at that, and now I'll turn it over to Anna.
Thank you, Eli. Let me to switch over and share my screen if you'll give me 1 second to adjust. So I'm honored to be here, and I'm really pleased that everyone could join us this morning. It's to see 40 people at 9:30 in the morning is a wonderful treat. I want to thank Professor Eli Friedman for inviting me to speak. I first met Professor Friedman in Guangzhou when I was just beginning my research and had no idea what this project would be. So it's actually quite a treat to be able to share what came out of that moment. And I also would like to thank Amla for making all the arrangements for today, as well as the East Asia program and the Contemporary China Initiative at Cornell University for hosting this talk this morning. It's my great honor to be here to open the speaker series today. So my talk today is entitled From Compradors to Hacendados, Cantonese Merchants in Peru and the Expanding Settler Colonial Frontiers of the Cantonese Pacific. It draws on a book project that I'm working on, which is titled Peruvian Chinese, Intimate Others, Peruvian Chinese Between Native Place, Nation, and World, 1880s to 1940s. The book will examine a series of print capitalist projects produced by Cantonese either in Peru or in their native places of Guangdong province, who maintain very close ties to Peru. And the book will situate these projects within a global settler colonial moment to examine the distinct ways in which settler colonialism as a global structure reshaped the Pacific during the late and early 20th centuries, and also shaped the subjectivities, the imaginaries, and the life trajectories of Cantonese migrants moving or traveling back and forth between Guangdong and Peru. These are people that we might consider Peruvian Chinese, but that's also a term that must be historicized, but I won't deal with that today. So what I'll do with my talk is sort of move through several sections of my talk, and after each major section, I will pause for a few minutes and take a couple of questions just to break up the Zoom fatigue that can quite easily set in. I'll start off doing a little bit of reading, but as we move more closely into the archival materials and case studies, then I can sort of ad lib more to also not be reading a paper, which can be quite exhausting for everybody to listen to on Zoom. So if you get lost along the way, if I don't explain something clearly, please let me know. There will be times and opportunities to ask questions as we move forward. So let me begin by taking you back into 1920s Peru. In 1921, in commemoration of the centennial anniversary of Peruvian independence, the China legation in Lima and prominent members of the Chinese community in Peru raised funds to commission a marble fountain from Italy for Lima's Park of the Exposition. The arrival of the fountain in 1924 occasioned an inaugural ceremony and the publication of the album of the Chinese colony in Peru, which commemorated the success of the Chinese community and its contributions to Peru's national development by featuring the colony's prominent commercial and agricultural elite across all the northern coastal provinces of the nation. The fountain offered an allegory of the album's narrative in material form. At the top of the fountain, in the photo on the left, a group of racialized figures depicted nature lavishing her protection upon the races, portraying a scene of racial hierarchy and uplift that invoked the production of nature through the practice of agriculture as a civilizing process. At the base of the fountain, the figures of a man and a woman, this is on the right-hand photograph, you can kind of see them just a little bit towards the bottom. A figure of a man and a woman are accompanied each by a small child, and each child is pouring water from their respective jugs into the fountain's basin, signaling that the rice and silk of the Yangtze Valley have arrived at the banks of the Amazon River, and the coffee and sugar of Chanchamayo Valley have arrived at the ports of the Huanghe River. As Henry Lefebvre noted in his work on the social production of space, such monuments invoke the splendor and meaning, but also the power and domination that accompany the state mode of production, as it works to territorialize and produce the national space. In commissioning and inaugurating the fountain and album, Chinese elites in Peru crafted an image of the Chinese colony that situated the community within the Peruvian state's mode of production during the aristocratic republic of 1884 to 1930. Towards these ends, the fountain communicated messages that associated national and racial progress with the harnessing and distribution of nature's bounty through the circulation of raw materials and commodities in national and global markets. And yet, when read critically, the fountain also conveyed messages about power and domination. It communicated messages of racial, spatial, and class hierarchies, namely of the domination of the educated, civilized, urban, Creole, and immigrant elite over backwards, rural, and laboring peasant mestizos, indios colonos, and by extension, even the former Black slaves and Chinese coolies who had once labored in large numbers on Peruvian plantations. The fountain also conveyed messages about the universality of these racial and spatial hierarchies as the fault lines of power, progress, civilization, and development across the world during the early 20th century. Thus, in commissioning the fountain, the elite of the Chinese colony in Peru sought to position themselves towards the top of the hierarchy within the Peruvian state's mode of production, but also within capitalism's global division of labor by situating the Chinese and Peruvian nations and peoples towards the top of these hierarchies. Well, Adam McEwen has recognized the fountain and the album of the Chinese colony as expressions of a cosmopolitan identity crafted by a Chinese transnational commercial elite in connection with the nation-making agendas of the Peruvian state and its aristocratic republic. I would like to probe these identity-making efforts further by examining their settler colonial dimensions and situating them within what Henry Yu describes as the Cantonese Pacific, a diasporic social world that took shape from the 1850s to the 1940s during the era of mass Cantonese or Chinese migrations across the Pacific, which corresponded with what Lorenzo Veracini describes in the 19th century as the global settler colonial moment. My goal is to overcome some dimensions, uncover some dimensions of this Cantonese Pacific world, but to also recover what Lisa Lowe recognizes as the often obscure racial intimacies created by the co-emergence of European liberalism, settler colonialism in the Americas, the transatlantic slave trade, and the expansion of the East, I would argue, add also the Trans-Pacific Coolie labor trade, as she does, and the expansion of the East Indies and China trades. So to accomplish this, I build on a recent set of studies emerging from East Asian, Asian American ethnic studies on Asians and settler colonialism. There's not a tremendous amount of work that has been done on this topic, but it is beginning to emerge. One area is on the expansion of the Japanese Empire and the movement of Asians through imperial expansion projects, especially settler colonial projects into the Americas. The works of Sidney Shu Liu and Eiichiro Azuma track these migrations and also look at how the movement of Japanese settlers into North America and also South America were part of an effort to and conceptualized as part of the building of a borderless empire, using migrants and settler colonial migration companies and schemes to advance an imperial project in which colonization and the bringing of land into development was considered a force of progress in a global context. And by immigrants traveling abroad and doing that for other peoples in other nations, they could earn the skills and contribute to national development projects elsewhere that would also feed back benefits towards the empire. But in the process of migrating, they also encountered tremendous amounts of racism by white settlers and by the nation states of North America. And this forced the sort of borderless empire of Japan to sort of look elsewhere and develop settler colonial schemes in other parts of the empire, other parts of the world in the Pacific, including moving some of them into South America to create a new kind of model of settler colonialism that was more hospitable than the settler colonialism which was defined by a white anti-Asian racism in North America. China as well had also some visions of migration as a form of colonialism, or specifically settler colonialism. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Chinese were not in any capacity colonizing anyone around the world. But there were intellectuals, reformers, revolutionaries who were concerned with China's deteriorating position in a global context, who began to regard the large Chinese diaspora around the world as a potential source of economic, cultural, and social progress, and for helping the transformation of China into a modern nation state. And they begin to play around with imaginaries of Chinese migrants and Chinese migration as a form of colonization, drawing specifically on white settler colonial nations where immigrants turned settlers become a kind of model. Although for the Chinese imaginary, the Huaqiao, the overseas Chinese migrant, is really a sojourner, so he doesn't go abroad to settle permanently, as much as he remains very devoted to, is supposed to remain very devoted to his native place and his nation, and make contributions and return back home, and also working, contributing his experience and his returns, both financially and his returns home, to the progress and development and racial uplift and national uplift of a struggling nation. So there's not a lot of systematic studies on this dynamic between migration as a form of colonization, but we do know from the works of people like some research by Evelyn Hudehart, a little bit of research by Tang Yaobing, that both figures like Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, who were essential to the reform movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were advocates of this. Kang Youwei looked to, after the end of the failure of the late Qing reforms, went to North America and ended up in Mexico, where he was involved in helping to finance and to expand and to purchase land in Torreon, Mexico, where there was a huge truck farming population of Chinese. There were farmer owners, as well as large Chinese laboring populations, one of the largest concentrations in South America at the time. And Liang Qichao, who also went into exile after the failure of the reforms, started to travel abroad and saw and through his traveling experiences, began to imagine migration, travel, and sojourning as colonization because it connected Chinese migrants and travelers across the world to processes of capitalist development and to the capitalist mode of development, exposing them to new mechanisms for modern world making, to modernizing enterprises, to things that could then strengthen the nation and equip the people for racial uplift and national survival in a global Darwinian struggle for survival between nations. But the most path-breaking work thus far has been the work of Shelley Chan, Diaspora's Homeland. In this book, she tracks diasporic moments, these kinds of moments when what was happening in the diaspora came flooding back home to China, forcing a kind of recognition of the experiences of the diaspora as somehow related to the modern nation making and what it meant for China to exist in a global context. And one of the moments she tracks in her book is the 1920s and 1930s, when the first sort of systematic studies by Chinese sociologists and anthropologists of overseas Chinese begins to get underway. And it's in that moment when a big debate unfolds around migration. Is it a form of colonization? And is it a force of progress and development that China could harness in a global context? And one of the figures who was part of this production of this research was Candela, one of the first sociologists of migrations, who studied migrations of Chinese and their laboring conditions outside beyond China, then subsequently, a couple of decades later, produced a book on the impact of migrations on their native places and the social, cultural, and economic uplift they brought. Ultimately, he would draw on a lot of this knowledge in the 1940s in the wake of the war with Japan to conceptualize migrations within China of Han people from the coastal, more developed areas to the Western, the Southwestern and Northwestern provinces as a force of settlement and progress and development that could help China recover during the war, to recover after the war, and be a force of national salvation. So these things have lingering histories, this earlier moment that continue to reiterate and are with us today if we think about Han migrants in Xinjiang, and we can discuss that a little bit later if you'd like. So aside from the work of Asian scholars, there are two pieces of scholarship that have been fundamentally critical for me in developing a very sharp critique of the position of Asians as settler colonists in the Americas, has been the work of Asian American scholars, Candice Fujikani and Jonathan Okamura, took up the critique of Haunani K. Trask, a native Hawaiian scholar and activist, who criticized Asians as being not simply victims and seeing themselves for not simply as simply victims of settler colonialism in Hawaii, but also needing to recognize that they have been beneficiaries of settler colonialism, because once they left the conditions of the laboring conditions on the plantations and settled into native Hawaiian society, they actually benefited they benefited from the structures of settler colonialism at the expense of the native Hawaiian peoples. And so Okamura and Fujikani put forward this critique and urged Asian American scholars to embrace it, and it has led to a tremendous interrogation of the complex positions of Asian Americans in Hawaii and in the Americas, and new work is unfolding out of that. Some of that work is Ikkyo Day's work, Alien Capital, which looks at how the Chinese situated on the American frontier, the railroad workers in North America and Canada and the US, became a sort of racialized other that became associated by white laborers and white settlers with all of the abstract and negative prices paid by labor as they become incorporated into industrial capitalism. So all the abstract processes like alienation from the means of production, the stereotypes against Asian workers are really the mechanisms that used to displace those alienations and those processes onto the bodies of Asians. And it allows the white worker to sort of cover up his own complicity in the process of settler settler colonialism, to view himself as a victim and not to have to deal with the victimhood and the dispossession of indigenous peoples and land and the displacement that their process of becoming workers, white workers, produces within a settler colonial context. So these works have helped to bring forward a very critical perspective on settler colonialism, race relations, labor relations, and capitalism, and the nuances of that. Now, to bring all of this together, one of the largest challenges of my project coming out of grad school, moving into producing a book, was really to figure out how to bring a history that is a transnational history of Chinese moving from South China into Peru and Latin America, into a global context, but also a hemispheric context of in the Americas, but in the East Asia context, a Pacific context, how to juggle these multiple spatialities and multiple histories that are kind of jostling with one another. And in order to tell the story of Peruvian Chinese, the reference must continuously be made to these processes that work at multiple scales. And for me, it's been the work of Henry Yu on the Cantonese Pacific that has been the most productive and the most useful framework to draw on. So let me explain briefly why I think of this. First, Henry Yu really recognizes, like Elizabeth Sen in her book on the Pacific crossings, that the emergence in 1850 of Hong Kong as a hub for trans-Pacific shipping, trade, and travel, that was intimately linked to the emergence of San Francisco as a hub of the Pacific trade in the Americas, tied not only to the gold rush, but also the expansion of the American and the closing of the American frontier. Really shifted the dynamics of migration within China. And because of the emergence of Hong Kong, the vast majority of people who moved out of China and started to migrate across the Pacific to the Americas, to Australia, to New Zealand, and to fill these settler colonial, the labor and commercial needs of these expanding settler colonial nations, were really Cantonese people instead of the Fujianese migrants who in an earlier period moved down towards Southeast Asia. So the vast majority of migrants moving across the Pacific were Cantonese, taking their language and their kinship and their business networks with them, but also even Fujianese and other Chinese migrants who wanted to move out across the Pacific were leaving from Hong Kong. So even Cantonese commercial firms and travel networks and credit ticket systems were the ones mediating a lot of these migrations. So for him, it was very much, for Henry Yu, it was very much a Cantonese Pacific moment that emerges. And so for Henry Yu, this is a world that is kind of like an expanding world. And I think Arif Durlik put it best in his analysis of Chinese on the American frontier, that what you have, and when this Cantonese Pacific world expands as it's moving, it is a frontier of Asians, not just Cantonese, we can add Japanese as well. There is an Asian moving frontier that is moving eastward across the Pacific and eastward across the Americas, that moves together and collides with and clashes in the middle with a westward moving white settler colonial frontier. And as this Cantonese Pacific expands, it is continuously encountering efforts either through racialized exclusion acts, which are legal acts, or acts of racial violence that push back the frontiers of this world. And like the scholars of settler colonialism in the Japanese Empire, what Henry Yu notices is that this Cantonese Pacific world is subject to a lot of shifting rhythms and routes because it depends on the temporalities of exclusion acts and violence, that the possibility to move to some places of North America become impossible, and that the migrations then shift southward into South America. And there's it's kind of like a jazz symphony that the migrants in the Cantonese Pacific are moving around, responding to the pressures and opportunities made available to them in the Americas at any given moment, or in the broader Pacific at any given moment. So there's a lot to actually keep in mind when we are tracking the movements of peoples in this world. Okay, for me to put the Cantonese Pacific and this global settler colonial moment is an important thing to do because it tells us something about what W.E.B. Du Bois described as the creation of a world in the 20th century defined by a deepening global color line. And Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds have done tremendous work to trace out the actually ideologies of whiteness that came to shape this world of the late 19th and early 20th centuries through the expansion of white men's settler colonial nations. But I think that adding in the stories of the Chinese tells us something really important about how Asian peoples, indigenous peoples, Black peoples across the Pacific contributed tremendous amounts of labor and capital and initiative to the making of a modern world, but ultimately were excluded through racial acts of exclusion, whether they were legal or violence, based on violence, that through the expansion of settler colonial processes helped to shape a world made for white men, dominated for white men, organized by white men, and that it was white men who got to set the terms of that organization and who would become the beneficiaries of that world. And we see this sort of playing out in this history quite clearly. Let me return to Glenn Coulthard later, but let me pause for a minute and see if anyone has questions at the moment before I move back into the case studies from the research. It's a lot of historiography and scholarly pieces to move together. Okay, so we continue then. All right. Well, thank you. So let me take you back to Peru. So when this album was produced in 1920, there had already been a history of Chinese migrations, obviously, at this point. Chinese migrations unfolded in two waves. The first was from 1849 to 1874, and these were the coolie labor migrations of people who signed contracts, whether they were tricked or free, or oftentimes not very clear what was going to happen to them. They moved from South China to Lima, to the port of Callao, which is close to Lima in the city. And then most of them were redistributed in the northern coastal provinces that you see here, from Lima, Ica also, but up northward, some in Arequipa, but mostly moving into plantation production of sugar and cotton to replace a dwindling Black slave labor force as all of the world moved more forward towards abolition. And this ended in 1874 when reports of abuses of the coolie labor trade to both Cuba and Peru became so disconcerting that the Qing Empire actually sent an investigative commission to Cuba and was supposed to also go to Peru, but was unable to complete its project because Peru ended up having a crisis and a war. But the report from Cuba, the Cuba Commission report, was so damaging that it enabled the Qing to bring in a complete end to the coolie labor trade, both in Cuba and Peru. And then subsequently in 1884, the Qing would then send the investigative commission to Peru to try to tease out from the remaining Chinese on the coastal regions, who some of them continued to work out their contracts on the plantations, the conditions that they lived under. Many of these migrants came from the popular immigrant districts of South China. So these are the spaces I wanted to show you that we're going to be referencing today. They came predominantly, you see Hong Kong in the lower right-hand corner with in red. And they came predominantly from all of these immigrant districts. But the elite that I will be talking about very closely came almost all of them from Zhongshan County. and with Macau very close by. It's no coincidence that one of the people who I will mention, his village was very close to Macau. He became someone who participated in the Qing Investigative Commission, and that facilitated later. He was one of the main people who opened the movement of free migrants to Peru, claiming there were a lot of opportunities there. So the wild Chinese who moved to Peru the coolies ended up in the northern coastal areas. As many of them finished their contracts, they also began to move out. They began to move out into the Amazonian regions and to the Andean highlands as well. Some of them escaped as fugitives, kind of like a fugitive slave, and disappeared. Others, as they transitioned out of the contracts, either they recontracted or they transitioned back into the local communities, taking up commerce, partnering with local women, having local children, intermarrying, and kind of folding into the local population and gradually disappearing that way. But when the merchants that I will be discussing went in the 1880s as part of the second wave of migrations, free migrations, they encountered already huge populations of freed and kind of settled Chinese inhabiting the coastal areas of northern Peru. Okay. So when the elite from Zhongshan start to move over there, they're moving at a moment when there is a huge national reconstruction project in Peru, because there's been a war with Chile that ended in 1884. And the economy, the landscape is, and particularly the plantations, because there were huge coolie uprisings as part of this war. Coolies welcomed the arrival of the Chilean army and helped to ransack and destroy and burn and kill people on the plantations. So it's a very destroyed atmosphere, and economically very destroyed and needing to be rebuilt. And all across Latin America, there was this need and this sort of consideration of national development in the wake of national liberation, the revolutions. So these post-colonial nations are struggling to figure out how to develop as robust, strong, independent nation states that can also survive on the national stage. And there's a kind of urge to get agricultural production going. This is part of the pattern in Latin America that leads to resource dependency that was already established during the colonial period, is now continuing. This need to rely on agricultural production as the mechanism, or mineral extraction, as the mechanism by which national economies can become robust and self-sufficient. But because of the moral stigma with plantation, agricultural, and slavery, there's a consideration of the need to move towards small farming in Latin America, or the desire to move towards small farming. And Juan Bautista Alberdi is one of the people who is sort of at the forefront of thinking about this. He comes up with the idea that to govern is to populate. And what Latin American nations could do is to sort of bring settler colonists from Europe, especially Northern Europe, where they're super white, a robust race of people who can come and take up settler colonial agriculture and bring more land into production, small farming ventures. And these states could then give them land and tools to get them going. Now, some nations like Argentina did a lot with this, but Peru, which tried to, was not very successful at doing this, and drew on the ideas of Alberti, and it tried to create a couple of projects, but they failed. And then they started to have discussions in the newspapers, the liberal elite who came to power in the wake of the war, thinking that maybe we can look at other labor sources again. So they begin to look at South Asia, but they decide that South Asians, while a very good labor force, they don't want to compete with the British Empire. This might get them into trouble in the sugar market. And so they want to avoid any complications with Britain. And then so they look to Indochina, then that falls apart for some reason in their imagination, and they start to think again about the Chinese. But like the Indo-Chinese, these are sort of poor people. But then they look to North America, where there's a different population of Chinese, the Gold Mountain guests, the ones who arrived on the credit ticket system rather than a coolie labor trade system, the ones that are sort of entrepreneurially minded, independent, who take on debt, who migrate, become successful workers or successful businessmen, establish their own enterprises, pay off their debt, and then become really example immigrants, model kind of minority figures. And so they decide that maybe this is a way to go. And so if Peru offers a sort of settler colonial scheme for these people, then they can come and settle and bring more land into production and help Peru integrate its national economy and help it integrate more closely with the global economy and become a more successful nation. None of this ever happens. The imaginaries, however, continue, and the imaginaries become a dynamizing force of what is actually happening on the ground. And I will explain what is actually happening on the ground bit by bit. But let me begin first by showing you what these imaginaries kind of look like. These new hegemonic visions were first presented to the world in publications, print capitalist publications and community albums, like the album of 1915, Lima Gráfico, which was produced by the Lima elite for Lima and for the larger nation to reposition Lima as a city, as a modern metropole tied to the global economy, and as the hub of a new commercial aristocracy. Chinese commercial elites appeared in Lima Gráfico as members of this aristocracy. If you look at the bottom right two pictures, you see Wing On Chong and Xia, which is the famous Wing On company, a branch, a subsidiary of Wing On, which is one of the four huge commercial firms, the department stores that were born out of Zhongshan and Hong Kong, and then had branches in Shanghai from migrants who had gone to Australia. And Pao Long and Xia is also a huge commercial firm established in Lima by the person who was a member of the Qing Investigative Commission report. These are two of the most powerful figures of the community. So they figure in this community album. But then they also these elites want to not only be represented alongside the Peruvian elite, but they also choose to create their own album in 1924, as I mentioned in my introduction, to demonstrate how they themselves fit into the national imaginary on their own terms. So following the precedents set by Lima, Chinese elites picture their businesses as part of an expanding network of institutions and infrastructures that facilitated the flows of capital and commodities that were integrating the national economy and connecting the national economy with a global economy. So they've pictured themselves inside of their commercial firms and their businesses, like we see here with Aurelio Pasanja, the godfather of the community, the individual who was part of the Qing Investigative Commission. He was returned in 1884 to open this commercial firm in Peru, but he was an importer of so-called Chinese luxury goods, for example, silk and tea for the Peruvian market. But these firms also traded and dealt with a lot of regional products in Peru and circulated regional products. So while they sold themselves as importers and exporters, they were also very much involved in the creation of and the integration of regional commercial circuits within Peru. But when they picture themselves, they talk less about that, and then they advertise all of the other businesses in Peru that they're connected to. They're connected to banking systems, German, Italian banks. They're connected to national railway projects, and even to a shipping railroad project, a shipping line that they tried to establish. One of the things that we see is that the importance of Hong Kong in this, because in the Banco Alemán Transatlántico, the bottom right-hand advertisement of a German bank, transatlantic German bank, is actually a trans-Pacific German bank as well, with branches in Hong Kong. And when you read the advertisement that they're making for the Chinese language readers, what all of these banks who advertise in this community album are telling the Chinese audience is if you come to our bank, then we have special agent who speaks Chinese, and then we have a firm, also a branch in Hong Kong, and they can process your remittances, and they help you with the trans-Pacific business transactions that you need to engage in. So it's actually a very much a commercial world that they're part of, and an expanding world of capitalist banking and railroads and infrastructure that links a trans-Pacific and a transatlantic world. All of these people are entrepreneurs who are sort of moving into Peru and Latin America with the new opportunities available in their area. And the Chinese are simply just one of the groups that are benefiting from that. The Chinese are elite, the Cantonese elite, the Zhongshan elite in particular, become such a powerful group that the elite are all serving this, like a group of about a dozen of them, the biggest plantation and commercial firm owners by the 1920s, they are all sort of serving as on the board of directors of the Benevolent Association, of the Zhongshan Native Place Association, also they've established this conglomeration to form a shipping line, a conglomeration to form an insurance company, and they've also got a newspaper that they're running all together. So it's a pretty tight group of people running this community and choosing how they're going to represent themselves. Aside from positioning themselves within the global circuits of capitalism and as movers and shakers within that they are also featuring themselves in the album as settlers, using photography as a mechanism by which to open up their interior spaces of their homes, which is quite unusual. And so Aurelio Pasanja, again, the godfather of this community, is sort of a key figure in this process of presenting himself and encouraging the community to present themselves as localized population, because so many of the pressures against them, anti-Asian sentiments, targeting them as foreign workers, as foreign businessmen who were robbing the poor Peruvian working class. Everything was about their commercial activity, as poor laborers to former coolies who were contaminating the national market area, the market area in Lima. Everything was really about their impact on the Peruvian public through their public activities. So opening up spaces and giving vision to the way they lived on the inside of their homes as settled, domesticated, bourgeois individuals who are part of this aristocratic republic, sort of as a way to counteract that. And Aurelio Pasanja was a strong advocate of localization as one of the mechanisms for integration and to counteracting anti-Asian racism, not only through advocating for this, but also through intermarriage. He married a Peruvian woman who's pictured here, and instead of having children with her, maybe they couldn't, but he adopted her niece and nephew and their families as his children. And so he became emblematic of an integrated sort of family where mestizaje takes place. And so very much appropriate models for becoming Peruvian subjects. And in addition to picturing their homes, they also pictured their plantations. So these were sites where the rural and the urban met. They depicted modern machinery on the plantation spaces and the rural spaces, especially the modern sugar mill, which you can see on the top right-hand side. And they pictured you see on the left-hand side, a white North American white-collared engineer who was one of the agents involved in sort of rationalizing and making more efficient plantation production from the labor on the plantation, rationalizing the work of the workers, to the way that the sugar mill was run. All of this was done to maximize profit and efficiency on the plantation. So this effort to picture the plantation was not simply to say we also do this kind of work. We have a successful commercial business and a successful agricultural business, but also to talk about how they are contributing to the economic advancement of the Peruvian nation through these engineering and rationalization efforts. They also talk about this in the bottom right-hand side, picture the workers inside the sugar mill as people who benefit from this sort of rationalization of production in the this produces the racial uplift of the mestizo worker. So they're very much positioning themselves in the state's project to create a functional working class mestizo working subject rather than the indigenous subject, and to bring everything sort of integrated for and maximize production for the global economy. So this connected them closely to the state's mode of production to integrate the rural agriculture areas, which were sort of lingering behind. But in the process, they picture themselves sort of out there on the landscape, kind of like John Wayne-esque figures, with these very romantic imaginaries, sort of settler colonial horseback riding, enjoying the leisurely romantic pastoral settings and lifestyle of the haciendas, complete with cattle, dogs, porches, families, and gardens. And through these visions, they combine the rural, pastoral, nomadic, romantic, and leisurely countryside with the industrial, productive, efficient, and urban modes of production. Cantonese elites use these to position themselves as kind of model citizens, model settlers in a new aristocratic republic, and participants in this ongoing structure of plantations as spaces of settler colonialism within the state's mode of production. All right, let me pause here before I complicate this picture a little bit more. So this is how Asians are sort of, Asian immigrants, and particularly Chinese or Cantonese elite from Zhongshan, are beneficiaries and perhaps even in some ways agents of these processes of the expansion of settler colonialism. Does anyone have any questions at the moment?
I see a question from Mimi.
Yes, I think we have a question from Michelle.
Hi.
Yep.
Yes, thank you for coming to talk with us. My question was about how you're discussing Cantonese migrants within the racial hierarchy in Peru. And I was wondering if you could provide more information on how Cantonese migrants viewed themselves like in relation to, as you're saying, like local populations, mestizo and indigenous populations, and how like their view of themselves sort of like affected their relationship with those people.
So it's complicated. It's complicated because, first, the history of the migration happened in two waves. The coolies, because they were bachelor communities, as soon as they were able to, or even on the plantations, when they had liaisons with local women, they were Black women and they were indigenous women, and sometimes mestizo women. And when they transitioned out of the plantations and settled, they also pursued relationships with these kinds of local women, but more increasingly towards mestizo women. They married within the church. They sought padrinajes, padrinos, which are like godfathers of the church. You have to have somebody sort of testify for you from the larger communities, oftentimes mestizo populations. So the early migrants, out of the necessity to sort of integrate and survive, because there were not Chinese women around, tended to mix in with the local population and then produce mixed offspring. And when they were doing that, I'm not sure that the mestizaje project was really so strongly conceptualized that they were trying to desire to do this. It was so out of necessity and for survival. So with regard to the later migrants, the elite that come, the free migrants, I haven't found traces of any kind of pejorative view towards the mestizo population. This is not, there's not a sense of a record that they certainly probably had ideas. And I imagine that they had ideas that were very similar to white Europeans, white North American populations, whiter Creole populations, that to be Creole, to be white, or to be whiter is better. So that mestizos were okay, but you don't want to associate with the indigenous people so much. They took a much more strategic approach in their intermarriage practices, which tells you something about their belief systems, that they chose to move up in the racial hierarchy. They chose to marry the daughters of these mixed race marriages because they could have access to somebody who spoke the language, because many of them are Cantonese speakers. But they chose to marry mestizo women, or on rare occasions, like Aurelio Pasanjaf, they could to marry somebody who fit into the whiter Creole population, although that was a little bit rarer. So the mestizaje was the mechanism through which they could enter into a kind of whitening trajectory. And mestizaje was a whitening project anyway, so they were just sort of following those trajectories. I think we see that more closely through their marriage practices than we're able to tell by their writings at all. Later in the 1930s, which I won't talk about today, there is a project, a magazine called Oriental that gets produced, which becomes the voice of a new generation, the offspring of these guys that I'm talking about today. And they create their own mestizaje project, which they call themselves Tusan, which comes from the Chinese Tu Sheng, which is locally born Chinese. And that's a kind of mixed population. Some of them are offspring of Chinese and Peruvian parentage. And it becomes a catch-all category. So they create their own sort of category for fitting into the mestizaje project of the nation. Is that enough for you to answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, so is there anyone else at the moment? Okay, then I'll continue and complicate this and talk about the victimization of Asians and the complexities of that. And here's more settler colonial visions of the plantations. One of the places where we get a different picture of the complex realities beneath the settler colonial imaginaries that these Hacendados, these Cantonese Hacendados are presenting of themselves, is in the cases that have been filed with the Ministry of Development. The Ministry of Development creates the labor section in the 1920s because there's so much labor unrest and complaints coming in specifically from the plantations, because the labor unions are really quite active in the cities. So that seems to be the main realm of activities for labor resistance. But in the countryside, there seems to be a greater need for a mechanism to address the problems there. And so in the labor petitions by people working on the plantations, they're against all kinds of hacendados, not just the Chinese, but you have a handful of cases against the Chinese, including several cases against Aurelio Pasanja, who again is the godfather of this community. And we'll take a look closely at one of them, which is the last one from the 1930s, because it had a lot of information and it has a lot of complexity to it. And this is the case of a group of Yanacones farmers who, Yanacones are sort of a tenant farmer system practice that existed in Peru at this time period. It originates from Inca practices, but it changes over time, and it's more of a tenant farming system at this point. So this family of Yanacone farmers they are working and residing on the plantation La Villa, Hacienda Villa, owned by Aurelio Pasanja. And he approaches them and says, look, I have this strip of land at the edge of the plantation that's not brought into production. I would like you to work the land. You can live there. You can do whatever you need to do to bring it into production. You can have it for 2 years without paying rent. And then after 2 years, we reassess everything. And then I'll start to charge you rent for living there. But for 2 years, all the benefits, all you sell from the land, you take all the income as compensation for all the work that you're putting into this. And so they agree to this, and you see their pictures here, and they go about and work the land for about a year. And then 1 year into this process, Aurelio Pasanja comes back to them and says, okay, well, now, we should sign a contract based on the terms we agreed to last year, just to formalize everything, because next year we'll have to do things differently and switch. And so they said, okay, but they're illiterate, so they don't really know what they're getting into. They sign the contracts based on the verbal agreement from the year before. 1 more year passes, And the Yanacones have fulfilled their terms of the agreement. They've brought the land into production. It's doing really well. It can now be integrated into the larger hacienda system. It will be highly productive. And they go to Aurelio Pasanda to work out the terms of everything. And he said, actually, you owe me 2 years worth of back rent. And they're like, wait a minute, this is not at all what we agreed to. And he said, okay, well, if you have disputes, then you need to take it up, not with me, because actually your contract that you signed is not with me, but it's with Julio Sasaki, who is a Japanese overseer for you guys as workers on the plantation. So you signed a contract with him, which they had no clue about. And so they go to Julio Sasaki, and then everything sort of becomes evident that this is a kind of Aurelio Pasanja has manipulated the sort of labor divisions, the racialized labor divisions on the plantation in order to engage in what Marxists would probably call an act of primitive accumulation, an act of essentially theft. These people have contributed, and what they say in their petition is, we contributed our labor, we used our tools, we invested into the property, and we brought this land that we dwelled on into production, we made it productive and profitable, and all of that is going to be now destroyed, and we're going to lose everything, and we're going to be kicked off the land. So there's an active dispossession in a sort of set of, in a plantation system that had all kinds of very complex labor arrangements between different racialized subjects, indigenous, mestizos, or Yanacones, or wage labor. And some of them even had communal land rights on the plantations. Indigenous people had communal land rights that they had carried with them since the early colonial period to reside and dwell and work land for themselves. And Yanacones also had land residential rights. But all of that is being done away with in this moment. And we don't know what the resolution of the case is, but we do know that this is a moment when we situate this case alongside all of the other cases. What becomes really evident in reading all of the cases is everything is in the process of transformation, that the Ministry of Development, in creating the labor section for these worker petitions, is actually creating a mechanism, a legalized mechanism through which the Ministry of Development will regulate the conditions of production and wage and the working day and the task. So this huge process led by the state is unfolding in this moment. And so it's a period when the relationship between the worker, whatever kind of work condition he has, and the land on the plantation is being rationalized, and the workers or indigenous people or mestizos, subjects, and Yanacones are being dispossessed of their right to reside and produce that land and derive its profits, that the profits belong to the plantation owner. Their labor is increasingly rationalized because there's now time periods being assigned to all of the labor tasks on the plantation. So there's this huge process of what Glenn Coldhart in his study of settler colonialism describes as the double-fold dimension of settler colonialism when it comes to indigenous people, which is that it is not simply the introduction of a capital labor relation, which is the production of the worker as a proletariat in industrial capitalism, who's regulated by the capitalist and who is paid through the wage and owns nothing else, owns no property or no land, or doesn't control the conditions of production or derive its benefits. And at the same time, it's the capital colonial relation is unfolding, which is the relationship between capital and land, a property. So there's a huge privatization of space within the plantation that is being dispossessed of people who once had a right to work and reside and labor there, and with complex arrangements. That is also being undone. And that's because this is a moment when the prices of sugar in the global economy are really high. And to maximize the benefits of selling sugar on the global economy, they want to bring more land into production. they want to rationalize the labor force to make it as efficient as possible, and engineer the mills to be as efficient as possible. But they also want to expand the frontiers of the plantation system, and they do that through a variety of means that dispossess indigenous people or mestizo workers or yanacones of their land rights or use rights or residential rights to those properties, and then take all the benefits of that. And this is what is trackable in these petitions. So here we see that how Aurelio Pausanja is still very much an agent and a beneficiary of all these processes unfolding in Peru. At the same time, he's also starting to be racialized by them. So the petition by the Yanacones say, que todo se lo llevó el chino. Their biggest complaint is the Chinaman took everything. And the Chino was what became a racialized term to designate this sort of racialized theft, this playing on stereotypes of the Chinese as sort of robbing these Chinese Peruvian working class subjects. This becomes a prominent discourse within the labor movement. And the labor movement, the unions are involved in helping the petitioners to organize their statements and create the language. So objectively speaking, he is very much an agent of these processes, but at the same time, the language is playing into a growing anti-Asian sentiment that is part of the creation of a mestizo working class subjectivity and identity within the nation that are part of these processes of the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. So he's already positioned in a very sort of both as victim, a racialized victim in some ways through the discourses, but also very much as a victimizer and of these kind of unfolding settler colonial practices. Okay, so we don't know what ended up happening because there's not a resolution to the case. Most of these cases, the documentation is in the grievances. The resolutions don't oftentimes get recorded so clearly. But I want to give another example of how this victimization, this racialization of Chinese plays out to push back the frontiers of the Cantonese Pacific, which we don't see as much with the elite, but we do see them in other sectors, and how the elite play a role in mediating. But does anyone have any questions at the moment? Okay, Joshua Young, if you would like to go. Hi, Joshua, would you like to speak?
Sorry, I muted and unmuted or the other way around. Thank you for this. This is fascinating. And I just have a real quick question about the anecdotal nature of this case that you're just pointing to, and the history of this. So the foreman was this Julio Sasaki, right? A Japanese Peruvian. And so along with this language about the Chinese, right? Is there any language about the Japanese as distinct from other Asians? And the reason seems, the 10s, 20s, and 30s is the rise of Japanese colonial expansion, right? And so, that the distinction between different East Asian nationalities,
Yes.
ethnicities, is something. So
absolutely. And it in these cases we don't see it, but where you see it is this case I refer to as 1930, and I think the Ministry of Development stops the cases right around that time. But the 1930s, it becomes really clear, and there are other sets of agricultural records or from the provinces where the Japanese really feature prominently as a problem. And the discourses are shifting. There is also newspapers, fascist newspapers that appear, and they really drive an anti-Asian sentiment to higher pitch than ever before. And the Japanese here figure as the main culprits because of the expanding empire. And so the sentiment that these sort of fascist newspapers, there's two of them, I don't recall the names of them, but there's a whole campaign that's been documented by a Peruvian scholar, and you can see the articles reprinted. If you want the reference, I can get it to you. But the idea of that period is that, well, Japan is a colonizing and expanding empire, and it's through these migrants, it is expanding into the Americas, and it's actually moving southward from North America. We see these immigrants coming here, and these immigrants are agents of Japanese imperial expansion. And what they will ultimately do is to displace us, and we will become the slaves of Asians inside of Latin America and inside of Peru. And Chinese, by extension, who are also being colonized, are under threat of being fully colonized by the Japanese, are also going to end up becoming agents of Japanese empire. So they too are part of the problem here. So it's something that the Chinese actually get roped into this Japanese colonial and imperial imaginary as people to be feared and resisted. And the attacks become more intense in the 1930s. Does that help and answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me move forward to another example that gives us a kind of a more complex vision of what the Cantonese Pacific looks like. So we've seen sort of the merchants on how they're moving into different sectors of the economy, moving into different spaces of the economy, and they have one of the largest commercial sectors in all of Latin America of the Chinese are in Peru. So you can imagine this expanding really in the northern coastal areas. These kinds of businesses like Aurelia Pasanja is operating but smaller scale all across the landscape. On the other side of the Pacific, there's also a strong infrastructure. So I'll turn my attention here to a different person, Yujuk-san, Cesario Chinfuk-san, who was also a prominent member of the community, also from Zhongshan. And he's the owner of Wing On Chong, the firm that is connected to Wing On in the department stores, the 4 department stores, one of the 4 department stores that are in Zhongshan, Hong Kong, Shanghai, these very successful business enterprises in South China. It has a branch in Hong Kong, and he is connected to the Tunghua Hospital in Hong Kong, which is a huge charitable association. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, when the Qing government and the early Republican government were not really fully prepared to handle the affairs of overseas Chinese, I think overseas Chinese affairs offices as a government institution or overseas Chinese affairs bureaus didn't really have the capacity to do much. They got started, I believe, in the 1920s. And what I've seen of those early archival records is that they were really doing a lot of information gathering, and they hardly knew how many people Chinese were in parts of the Americas, particularly South America. And they were trying to, send teachers there and educate the Chinese and educate local populations in Cantonese and nationalism. But it was very chaotic and incomplete knowledge of the world that they had. So the Tunghua Hospital becomes like kind of a hub of governance, self-governance in the diasporic communities. This is again a key element in that Cantonese Pacific, is how voluntary associations play a fundamental role in addressing social problems and in addressing even problems of racial exclusion and violence. And I'll give you an example of that through this person. So Cesario Chinfuk-san, who is a member of the Benevolent Association in Lima, was a key figure linking this trans-Pacific world for Peruvian Chinese or Cantonese in Peru. He had businesses in Panama and Brazil and Chile, so he was critical in linking several places in Latin America across the Pacific to governing mechanisms over there. In 1909, There is a worker uprising, and that leads to violent attack in Lima on a little alleyway called Callejón Otaiza, which is very close to the market, the central food market in Lima. And this has been attacked by working class because it's the conditions of destitution of the poor Chinese that live there. Many of them were former coolies who have now aged out of the plantation system. They're begging on the streets. There's a lot of gambling, there's opium, there's prostitution, there's all kinds of poverty and crowdedness. Overcrowding in this area, and people are really just surviving. These are the workers whose bodies have been used up. There's not a lot that they can do, so they beg on the streets, and it's considered unsanitary. It comes under attack. The governor of Lima tries to do an assessment and a survey, and is building up towards a kind of effort to resolve this problem. But before he can take action, the workers do, and they violently destroy parts of this alleyway, and it sort of drives about 500 Cantonese, people of Cantonese origin, leaves them destitute and homeless and living out on the streets. And so now this is a problem. What do you do with these people? And so the elite of the community, the Chinese community, step in very quickly to address this problem, because this reflects a kind of shame, a racial shame and humiliation for them. Already that these destitute people exist. The coolie problem was something that they've tried to get away from since their arrival. And now it's sort of this destitute homeless community, group of 500 people need to be attended to, housed, and accommodations made for them for the long term. So the elite organized through the Benevolent Association in Lima. And what they end up doing is working with the Tunghua Hospital in Hong Kong, along with a group of organizations in Guangzhou, on the interior of Guangdong province, these 9 charitable halls. They create a repatriation project to get them out and send them back. Get them away, take care of them by sort of basically exporting them back home. Now, many of them had not been home to their native places for 40, 50 years. So they didn't know where they were going to. They had no connections there, no ties to family anymore. Some of them maybe even didn't really remember how to speak parts of the language. So you have newspaper accounts describing how some of them were now returning to a land that no one recognizes them anymore, and even describing how they were crying when they were sitting on the docks waiting to board the ships as they were being sent back home. And this introduces a practice that continues from 1909 into the 1930s. So as older Chinese who become sort of increasingly destitute with no family members to take care of them, who are relying on the benevolent associations and native place associations to sort of take care of them as they age along the northern coastal provinces, every once in a while, the elite of Lima organize a repatriation project, gather them up, and send them back across the Pacific. This is one of the last images of people being who were set to be deported in 1935. Deported because many of them didn't do this by choice. They're really quite old. I don't know how many. We don't have records of what happened on the other side, but this gives you a sense. Okay, and this gives you a sense of what this Cantonese Pacific world looks like, just from a glimpse of Lima, but you can imagine this expanded to every place across the Pacific where Chinese are located. So in order to facilitate this project in Peru, on the right-hand side, it involved collaboration with the Peruvian government and the China legation, but also overseen by elites, a commercial elite who are members of the benevolent associations. And they are overseeing the native place voluntary associations of each individual native place. So the people from Zhongshan and the people from other areas each have their associations. So they connect all of this, they gather up the elderly people, And through these associations, they send back bones and coffins, they send charitable donations, they send the elderly bachelors and destitute returnees. So this whole mechanism gets worked out through this repatriation project. And on the other side of the Pacific, with Hong Kong government underneath the auspices of the Hong Kong government, the Tsinghua Hospital is operating as the main receiving mechanism. And it has connections to native places on the interior of Guangdong province that match sort of these native place associations that are in Peru and other parts of the Pacific. And then it helps to redistribute people back to their native places who need to find a home. But then for people who don't have anywhere to go, these elderly destitute bachelors, they are then put into this Peruvian Chinese Peaceful Gatherings Asylum, which is created in 1909 after the destruction of the alleyway in Lima. And it is fundraised by Peruvian elites in Peru, and money is shipped across the Pacific as well through all of these mechanisms, going from the Tsinghua Hospital in collaboration with the Kuomintang government in Guangzhou, down to the 9 charitable halls. And one particular charitable hall, the Ayu Shantang, the Ayu Charity Hall, established in 1871, becomes the overseer of the Peruvian Chinese Peaceful Gatherings Asylum. And this is the sort of self-governance mechanisms, collaborating with state mechanisms that don't have the capacity to do the work to repatriate these subjects, sort of the Chinese elite across the Pacific, the Cantonese elite organizing to make these repatriations possible and solve the problems that emerge out of acts of racial violence. So this is one example of how what I call sort of the world comes home through the pushing back of the Cantonese Pacific. Any questions at the moment? Okay, so I guess I can give you another example, but I want to make time to wrap up the talk and take questions from the audience, because I think we only have what's like 20 minutes or so, Eli? Yeah, okay.
Until 11.
Yeah, okay. So what I tried to give you a glimpse at, there are other projects that I look at, which are print capitalist projects that distribute news of how the world comes home, how reports like these about racial violence and how it pushes the frontiers back and actually sends people back across the Pacific, is one of the ways we can track the enclosures of the Cantonese Pacific. So it's both the expansion and simultaneous enclosure of this world. But just wrap up my talk very briefly, I think the main thing to think about the Cantonese Pacific from Henry Yu and the work of W. Du Bois, Henry Reynolds, and Marilyn Lake, as sort of a global, the making of a global color line, and how settler colonialism is a structure that once in place, it continuously produces a kind of indigenous dispossession, but at the same time positions Asians, immigrants in very complicated positions where they can be both agents, beneficiaries of settler colonial practices, particularly the elites, but also as victims of it, racialized others who through acts of racial violence and legalized exclusion acts are pushed back, either killed sometimes in massacres through acts of violence, or they're dispossessed of their belongings in their homes, left destitute, and sometimes forced, left with no resources but to go back or to be sent back to their native places. And then the native places in China become places that absorb the costs of these processes and this violence of settler colonial expansion. So these stories are fundamentally a part of the ongoing legacy of settler colonialism as a structure that remade the world and the Pacific during the 19th century, and in particular that paved the way toward the making of a white man's world across the world. Okay, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.